All right, we're gonna get started. So for the rest of class, so basically the next 2 weeks before we do our final presentations, we're gonna look at a couple kind of like case studies of application of system models in some interesting policies that I've selected, and we can see kind of the types of analyses that folks have done to either look at policies in retrospect or to even actually help policies get put into place. So today we're going to start talking about carbon taxes and cap and trade. So this is a topic that has kind of come up throughout the class kind of informally, but here we're going to spend a little bit of time to kind of talk about the different mechanisms that you can actually use to maybe deter carbon mitigation. All right, so first thing, so externalities. So an externality, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this concept, especially if you've taken some kind of economics class or environmental economics class, right? So this is a side effect of some activity that affects other parties without getting reflected in a particular transaction for a good or service, right? So some of you may die, but that's a sacrifice that I'm willing to make, right? Because it doesn't actually affect me. The externalities, by definition, are affecting people outside of that transaction. So if your neighbor is playing loud music all night, right, and you can't sleep, that's a externality. So I dump toxic waste and you get sick. So this is kind of the classic version of this when we think about pollutants. Any questions about externalities? Right. So the kind of classic version of this when we think about emissions is when I partake in the purchase of a good or using a particular service, if that has carbon emissions, if I'm in a non-policy world, right, those carbon emissions will go out, cause global warming, and affect a lot of people who had nothing to do with that particular transaction, right? So if that's driving a car, riding a plane, whatever it is. And so how do we prevent that from happening, or at least try to internalize that? Yeah.
We can give the externalities a cost.
Yeah, that's right. And so, there's a kind of twofold thing that happens when you try to enforce a cost to an externality, right? And so let's say I know that the carbon emissions from driving my car, some amount, leads to some amount of damages, which then I enforce a cost to. So the person who drives that car now has to pay a little bit extra money. And so the two ways that this helps to mitigate is that one, I may partake in that activity a little bit less because of the higher cost. And then two, the money that was paid for those costs may actually go back into some kind of mechanism to help promote mitigation, right? And so these price signals will work in multiple ways to try and address that externality. So when I'm talking about we add this extra cost, there are kind of two common mechanisms that we talk about to specifically internalize the costs associated with carbon damages. So the first is a carbon tax. And so this is where we put some kind of price on carbon emissions. And so anytime someone emits carbon, they have to pay a little bit of extra money. And then you have something known as cap and trade, where you basically have permits or allowances that are required to emit carbon. And so basically polluters have to hold some amount of permits to equal to the amount of the cap. And to increase the emissions, if you wanted to emit more than the cap, then you have to buy those permits from someone else. And then as time goes on, you could lower the amount of permits that are allowed, and so that brings down the overall amount of carbon that gets emitted. This can also be known as an emissions trading scheme in many places. Yeah.
After the carbon is emitted, does the permit get burned? Like what happens to the permit?
No, I mean, the permit is just a representation of how much you're allowed to emit. And so every year, basically, let's say you have 50 different entities in your region who are emitting stuff. Basically, you hand out these allowances or permits to those 50 people, and that basically tells everyone, okay, in totality, there's X number of permits, and you can only emit this much. And then next year, you would hand out more permits and say, oh, actually, the total amount you can do this year is only Y amount. And so every year, the idea is that you reduce the number of permits that you give out.
Okay, yeah, I was thinking like currency, like credit.
Yeah, it can be traded like a currency, because you imagine, so the idea, and we'll talk about this more in a second, but the idea is like, let's say you had these 50 and they don't actually emit the same amount, right? And so one person actually has some extra permits because they don't actually use all of them up. But then there's another guy in that 50 that says, oh, I actually need a little bit more. Let me buy those permits from you, right? And we'll talk in more detail about kind of the implications of that trading and the implications of having like a limited pool of allowances. Okay, but we're going to get to that second. We're going to start off with, I think conceptually, the sort of easier one. So carbon tax. So this plot on the right-hand side is a visualization of carbon taxes that are enforced by countries and regions around the world, okay? So, first question, so how aligned are the prices of carbon worldwide when we think about the value of the tax? And you can see it's pretty big, right? So anywhere between, well, 0, a lot of countries don't have any. So less than 5, I would say, to above 50. And yeah, we can see that the structure of these carbon taxes vary quite a bit as well, right? Some are going to be a lot more volatile. Some are flat and update in smaller increments of time. Okay. Yes.
Why do the costs vary over time? I assume that they will just continually go up over time.
Yeah. Well, so when we think So okay, actually, let me ask. Why do you think it would go up over time?
I assume that the cost per carbon either stays the same or goes up as carbon emissions continue to increase, therefore the greater need to reduce it. That's an upward pressure on the price.
Yep. So that's exactly right. Plus the idea that the value of the damages starts to increase because you're discounting into the future and you get closer to the future, so those values start to look bigger and bigger as you get closer to when they start happening. But yes, that's exactly right. So when we think about the actual carbon price that reflects the damages that are happening, that you would definitely expect that to sort of increase over time. To some degree, you have that reflected in these trends where we typically, I would say, see most carbon taxes increasing over time. Yeah.
I would phrase the question then, in what scenario would that actually go down? Is that simply just a market mechanism in which supply versus demand kind of problems?
Yes. So let me be extra clear here. These are carbon taxes. These are not representing necessarily the social costs of carbon or damages tied to prices, right? It is, and I'm not going to say arbitrary, but the taxes can really be set at whatever you want them to be set at, right? So, to some degree, these are going to be are going to try and get pegged in some way to, those values, but there could certainly be, some market mechanisms that might make it go down. Why might that happen at a local level? Any ideas? Yeah.
Well, just policy, like if a new party gets elected that is like, oh, we don't believe in climate change, they might just either fully abolish it or just decrease it by a lot.
Yes. Yeah. So that's one. So politics can change it. Anything else? Yeah.
Aren't some of these markets voluntary, so they're not necessarily going off of mandatory carbon tax systems, but they're voluntary in who's buying the actual?
Yeah. Yeah, so it can be a product of market supply and demand. And so one thing that can happen is that if you have an overabundance in supply of some kind of renewable resource, for example, that can actually drive the prices down because because the sort of marginal need to mitigate is lowered, right? So lots of things can kind of play into the sort of general prices, but the trend typically is going to be upwards. Okay, what does it mean if the carbon price that is getting enforced by a particular government is higher or lower than the social cost of carbon? Yeah.
Well, if it's lower, that means that the externality is not fully internalized, so that it don't really.
If the tax is lower than the social cost of carbon. Right, and so we think that the damages from carbon will sort of outweigh what's being covered by these taxes, essentially. Right. And so does anyone remember what we were talking about for the sort of most recent reasonable estimates of the social cost of carbon? Yeah, like $180 to $200 a ton. So these are still substantially lower, right? Okay. Let's take a minute and have you guys think about this particular question. You guys are all, starting on your projects already. And so you could think of it in that context, but also sort of more generically from a modeling perspective. So maybe we don't have to get into like such small groups, but maybe with like 2 or 3 people, talk for a moment about how you might model these impacts, the specific impacts of the CO2 tax, and see if you can think through not only how to implement it, but what that actually does in a particular model. So I'm going to give you guys like 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll see what you guys have to say.
Operate your natural gas plant, and then you have a certain amount of emissions associated with operating it, with running it at a certain level, then you just add that basically on top of the operating cost, like the emissions times whatever the tax burden. And then, yeah, it probably discourages to some extent for the model to use high emissions assets. Depending on how high the consumption is. If it's higher, obviously, server and so on, renewable and stuff. Or if it's lower, yeah, that's one of the
Basically looking at like how much the government is getting versus what is being done to see how the
yeah, because you increase the cost, right? If you have like a coal power plant or something, it's much more expensive to run it. Because you have a lot of emissions. I mean, if the tax is low, the effect might be
looking at
very small, but like if the tax is high,
spending, right?
you probably prevent
affects these
a lot of the
being
coal
lower,
to run, except if you really need it.
like
Yeah, or like what you're saying, to push to, the infrastructure to push it to other.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, if the carbon tax is too low, maybe the coal plant is, well, it's probably anyways it might expensive, but maybe then, like, okay, maybe you just pay it and it's fine, it's a little cheaper, but like, yeah. Yeah, this, no, she didn't turn it into a
So she released a grant for it.
Oh, really? Oh, was she on that?
Yeah, this is
All right, let's maybe go around the room. What do you guys talk about?
I think like right now we're talking about like modeling where the funding goes specifically after this.
Sure, okay.
Whether it should go towards like investments in like efficiencies for industry to tap into to lower their emissions over time, or like carbon sequestration projects that would capture some of that carbon in the air, or just like putting easement on land so that we're not developing more emissions.
Yeah, okay. So then when we talk about, so carbon taxes, we think about the cost effect on mitigation, and then you have the sort of tax revenue effect on mitigation. And so you guys were mainly focusing on this piece then, right? So what you do with the money. So what sorts of things were you talking about in terms of the revenue getting spent on? Sorry, I was.
Oh, like an efficiency fund, so like if industry wanted to tap in.
Okay. So efficiency fund,
Carbon sequestration projects.
carbon sequestration. Okay.
So like land easements.
Land
like
easements.
conservation of land.
Okay. Great. So, one second. So, one thing that, one concept to think about here is that when you enforce the carbon tax, right? So have we talked about the McKinsey curve? Anyone remember this? No. Okay. So So the McKinsey curve is kind of this idea where this is total amount of mitigation, and this is the cost of mitigation. So for any particular strategy, let's say you might have something that looks like this. Maybe this is like LED lights. So the idea is that there's a particular technology or behavior, something that you can implement to help mitigate some amount of carbon, and that this is how much you mitigate, and then this is how much it costs, right? And so some things are going to be positive, which means that you would probably partake in these types of things kind of no matter what, because they're just sort of economically efficient. And so so in the McKinsey curve, you order mitigation options from like least cost to most cost, and then you can see how much gets mitigated. And then you may have things that cost more and more to mitigate, right? And so maybe something like this would be like electric vehicles. Maybe the cost to mitigate it is more than you could make your money back right now. Although maybe that's not a particularly great example, because actually TCOs are pretty good. But just for the sake of this, right? And so in a sort of baseline society, you might think that, oh, everything that's negative cost we ought to be doing anyways, and then this stuff you wouldn't, like the market wouldn't dictate that you would be implementing these things. And the general idea is that, if I were to implement a carbon price, or actually I should be doing it on the other axis. If I implement some kind of carbon price like this, then suddenly some of the other things end up getting worth doing, because the sort of the extra cost of the carbon makes these things worth it. So one of the reasons why I'm talking about this in relation to our discussion on tax revenue effect on mitigation is because one of the benefits is that as you obtain revenue from the carbon economy, you can actually help to pay for some of these things that even under the carbon tax might not still be done, right? And so the idea is that This stuff in blue, you kind of do anyways. These things that fall under the carbon tax would be effects that happen directly as a result of the mitigation. And then actually on top of that, you might be able to partake in some more activities from the revenues in mitigation. So yeah, I think the individual examples are great. When we think about it from like a strategic perspective, you probably want to make sure, well, it would make a lot of sense to think about it from a perspective where you are strategically targeting specific types of mitigation options. So good. Okay, what about you guys?
Yeah, we talked most about it more in the context of maybe like a optimization model, like the energy systems models.
Okay.
And there you could like for each decision, like for example running a natural gas plant, calculate what the carbon emissions of each decision would be, like producing 1 megawatt hour of natural gas, and then you can multiply the carbon intensity with the carbon tax and add that cost onto the cost of that decision. And then
Yeah.
you see what happens, like with
So
changing.
So in the context of an optimization, we are, what would your overall objective function be trying to do?
Probably reduce costs.
Right, so if we minimize cost, and this is a function of X activity, then the idea, right, is that, I guess, sum of all this activity. So the idea is that you are in some way, so these may have some kind of cost associated with them at first, and adding the carbon tax, you probably have something like a X activity times X emission, or not X, some amount of emissions times your tax, right? And so this would be a cost component term. Okay, so that's good in terms of how it would structure, but how would you imagine that this actually, how does this end up affecting the optimization? How would this play out? Yeah.
I mean, if the carbon tax is very low, then it might not change anything at all, but as soon as, for example, like, I don't know, the natural gas plant that maybe runs because it has a lower cost than the other next best option, but if maybe the difference is, I don't know, $10, probably not real, but like $10, and then the cost is $15, then I would then probably decide not to run the natural gas plant anymore and choose the other option that might have less emissions.
So basically, your activity is now balancing between the cost of that activity and your carbon taxes, right? And so if I were to rewrite this equation, this might be equal to, let's use a term called, okay, equal to X activity, and instead of one kind of straight up cost, right, it's going to be plus C emissions and C tax. I guess it would be better to have that as a subscript, but whatever. So normally, right, in the default, you would just operate the thing that costs the least here, but now you're balancing against what costs the least here plus the cost of my carbon tax. And so even if it's really cheap here, if it's really expensive here, you would prefer to do less of that activity. And so that's the way a pretty sort of simple formulation will be able to kind of propagate the effects of the carbon tax into how it makes a decision about the amount of activity that happens. Yeah.
And then you can also probably calculate in each year of the optimization runs the revenue you're getting, and maybe then for the next year you can have like a constraint that you have like a budget to fund like other options.
Yeah. Yeah. If you wanted to think about like this side of things, yes, you could do something like that. Okay. In the back, any other things to think about?
We didn't really talk about anything new.
Okay.
We talked about something very similar to that, and how the cost puts downward pressure on activity after a certain point.
Okay. So you guys were more focused on the left effect.
Yes.
Okay, cool. And then on this left side, you guys, any things that you guys wanted to add? No? Yeah.
Maybe it's kind of it goes kind of in turn with this, but also like essentially the macro market version in kind of the end use for whatever happens, whether it's energy or others, like the essentially elasticity for the products that come downstream from like either production or things like that.
Yeah. So that would all, I think, mainly play out on the kind of left-hand side, the cost effect on mitigation. Yeah, I mean, what we implemented here is just a small example of how you would do it in this optimization setting, but in the context of these, like maybe like a larger equilibrium model, you could represent that certainly. Okay, great. So let me jump back to the slides, and as you think about this, just know that I think if you're looking for more to do in your project, I think this could be something that could be implemented, I think in most people's projects, if you wanted to expand the scope a little bit. And obviously, if you have questions about that, you can let me know, and I'm happy to help out. So, this type of thing has been implemented in some of those sort of larger scale models that we've talked about. So in EMF, right, so that's the Energy Modeling Forum out of Stanford that I was talking about. In EMF 32, or in EMF, they had 32 carbon scenarios that they looked at, where a lot of these large energy system models, they kind of applied different carbon taxes to them to kind of see what the overall effect on carbon emissions were. So here we don't see all of the details of like what I was just talking about, right, with the actual effects on that sort of activity or the actual effects on the revenue and what those go to. But here they implement those effects and then they calculate what the sort of carbon emissions change was. And so here we can see across, let's see, 11 different models, what happens when you implement carbon taxes. And so they have $25 tax at 1%, $25 tax at 5% discount, $50 tax at 1% discount, and $50 tax at 5% discount, right? And so the discount rates, as I was mentioning, affects how far out into the future we are, or how the damages are kind of internalized based on based on how you sort of value those damages in the future. So you need that because over time you need to know how much the carbon tax is valued at, and basically here we can see a comparison of a reference point, which has no taxes, versus what happens as you implement these taxes over time. And so obviously, right, lower carbon taxes are kind of the least aggressive compared to kind of the most aggressive, where you might be mitigating something like, a lot of these are saying, you know, maybe 50% of your emissions or more by the end of the period, versus here, there's kind of a decline at first as you partake in certain mitigation options, but then, right, in that like McKinsey curve, you only go to a certain point, and so those mitigations in the future kind of taper off. Okay? So this is kind of a nice high level kind of peek at the effect of these carbon taxes that get implemented. And so when we think about this from a policy perspective, it kind of tells us what you might be able to do and what you might be able to expect from an emissions mitigation perspective for implementing any of these policies. And I think importantly, I mean, one of the nice things about this energy modeling forum is that there's all these things that go into these models, endless assumptions, right? You know, think about the models that you guys are building and the assumptions that are built into that. This is kind of like that, but just at a very much larger scale. But kind of despite all of the differences between the models, right, you do see sort of generally decent agreements between different models and what the outcomes are saying. Okay, and right, the last thing that I'll kind of mention is that we see the examples of existing carbon taxes, and with the most recent updates, right, we're seeing social cost of carbon is probably a lot closer to $200 a ton than a lot of what we're seeing at like the $40 to $50 a ton implemented. And so that speaks to the fact that even though certain governments are pushing for carbon pricing, the taxes that are implemented are likely not high enough to kind of totally internalize the damages that we're causing. And so a lot more mitigation needs to happen to, correct that. Okay, any questions? All right. Okay, so that is our kind of coverage of carbon taxes. And so now we're going to talk about the concept of cap and trade, which is similar in many regards. But the mechanism with which it works is, I guess, a little fundamentally different. So let me talk about allowances in a little bit more detail. So this was implemented back in 2013 in California. There are other regions around the world that do have cap and trade or emission trading schemes. And there are certain nuances of the programs that might be slightly different, but in general, it's going to work in this way, right? And so here, a statewide cap on the total emissions are put into place, right? And so in the state of California, I consider every entity that emits carbon, I add all of that carbon up, and then I figure out how much I want to reduce it on an annual basis. So every year in California, we drop the amount of the amount of the cap by about 2 to 3%. Okay, and then all the industries that emit carbon have to obtain a permit known as an allowance, as I was just kind of mentioning earlier. And so for every amount of emissions that they produce, they have to basically use up an allowance. And every year, as that cap goes down, the amount of permits that are provided to all of these entities are decreased. And so, what does that do? What does that cause the entities to do? That puts pressure on them to essentially produce less carbon, right? Or to purchase allowances. Okay, so I'm a company, and I produce some amount of emissions, and I actually see that the allowances that I got this year are not enough for me to emit everything that I would want to emit. So what does that cause me to do? I can do, yeah.
Well, if the cost of buying new allowances is lower than the abatement cost, then I would buy new allowances. If the abatement cost is lower, I would try to abate my emissions.
Yeah, exactly. So my two options are to decrease my emissions or to purchase allowances. And I'm going to do the one that's cheaper. Okay. And so maybe in a given year, I'll say, oh, it's okay, I'm just going to buy allowances. And that's going to cost me less money than decreasing my emissions. But then let's say next year, the cap goes down even more, and now I have to abate my carbon by an even greater amount. And then let's say I bought allowances from entity A last year. Now entity A comes to me and says, well, actually, I don't have as many credits to sell because the cap decreased. Or they might say, oh, there's not as many credits floating around, and the prices are higher, so you have to pay me more. And in which case, I might say, do the math again and say, okay, actually, it makes more sense for me to try and decrease carbon. So that's kind of the way this is designed to work. And the idea is that with this trading mechanism, you are, I guess, sort of guaranteed good economic outcomes, right? Because everyone is going to go from like lowest cost mitigation first until and then there's a whole sort of supply and demand dynamic with the allowances, and so you are getting these mitigation options in kind of the same economic efficiency as you would with a carbon tax. Yeah, the way that you get distributed pollution allowances, they hold this sort of electronic auction several times a year to distribute those allowances. So at first, a large amount of the allowances are given away for free, and then some of them are sold, right? This helps set a sort of baseline for your permit market, and then more and more of those allowances are auctioned as time goes on. And so this is a way for the government to essentially raise funds from basically selling these allowances. Does anyone know how those funds are spent? Yeah.
Like clean energy investment or research and.
Do you know the name of the? Yeah.
GGRF, Greenhouse
Yes.
Gas Reduction Fund.
Yeah, that's right. So if you ever hear of GGRF, that is in reference to funds that come out of the cap and trade system, so greenhouse gas emissions reduction fund, and that is spent on lots of different things, like clean energy measures, like electric vehicle incentives, for example, in the state of California, have typically come out of the GGRF funds. And there's always kind of like a fight over who gets access to those funds and what they end up covering. So yeah, so California's cap and trade program. This was originally the original impetus behind this was AB 32, right? AB 32 being California's kind of landmark first big climate policy push. The rule was passed in 2009 and came into effect in 2012. And then it declines by, again, as I was saying, about 3% annually. There are a couple of other regions that kind of link their cap and trade programs with California, specifically in Canada. It was up for renewal back, actually, I guess almost 10 years ago at this point. But AB 398 was passed in 2017 that helped to extend our cap and trade program through 2030. Okay. Okay. What does the allowance budget look like? So something like this. These are the allowance budgets. So green is our cap. We have offsets, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment. And then the emissions projection as a result of having this allowance allocation looks something like the line in red on the secondary y-axis. And so the idea is that we decrease our total statewide annual emissions by something like 500-ish million tons a year, 475 million tons a year, and down to around 250 million tons a year by 2030. Okay. Any questions? All right. Let's see here. Why don't we actually take this is a good spot to maybe take a break for a couple of minutes. So let's say 5 minutes and then we'll continue.
allowance budget is the scale on the left, just the
Yeah.
numbers, right? Oh.
Yeah.
Can we do with the smog test?
Hmm?
Smog test, like for cars, like the smog test requirement, like every 3 years for your vehicle. Can we do that?
What about it?
Oh, I just think it was interesting. I guess I was just thinking about it. It's essentially just for consumers, right? Like just thinking of like the dynamic of it, and then it's used kind of conceptually the same. I think that money is used for like researcher grants or stuff like that for like clean energy programs or transportation.
Okay. Yeah. But this is a separate thing from, like, smog doesn't have anything to do with the greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a separate program. I mean, it has some of the revenues might be used to support certain types of activities, but it's not really connected with these in the same way.
Okay. As a carbon tax or cap and trade and stuff.
Yeah. Smog is looking at particular pollutants of a certain type, and the regulation there is more having to do with like particulate emission limits on certain on tailpipe emissions, and so there are very specific rules about that. And then the smog is like a compliance check, essentially. Yeah. Yeah.
When was this chart made?
A couple years ago, I think. Why?
I was just curious if the values were real or just extracted.
I think it goes. Yeah, actually, I'm not entirely sure. I'll double check. Yeah. It's there are like periods of time where the cap and trade program becomes of a lot of interest to like the research community, where I like derive a lot of these figures sometimes, and that's often like when the policy is formed or when it's going on under some kind of review period, and they're like updating it. So this could be from around the like 2017 time period, but then you do occasionally have like people who are retroactively looking at the program and doing some analyses, but those will be kind of like a little bit more sparse over time. All right, so let's get back into it. So this chart, we talked about the sort of allowance budget and the cap. Okay, and there's also these things called offsets. And so what is an offset? So carbon offsets are credits for verified emission reductions from a source outside the cap and trade program. So these can be used by covered entities to meet obligations instead of using allowances or reducing on-site emissions. So, for example, let's say some company comes along and gets like half the population of California to just like stop eating beef. Okay. The sort of general idea here is that company may not have, they don't contribute substantially to emissions, and so they may not have allowances that were awarded, but they could apply to have CARB verify that in fact, without us, then all these people wouldn't have switched to being vegetarian or something, right? And then you can look at that and see, oh, there's actually this like very measurable decrease in emissions from their activities, and so they can have, we'll give them these offsets, right? That is basically CARB saying, oh, we verified that something that you did helps to kind of decrease those emissions. Okay, and so what is the value of these offsets, right? So this company gets a bunch of these offsets, and they're like, okay, great, I have all these like offset credits. Well, you can actually use those to replace allowances. And so now you think about it, you've lowered emissions a bunch, and there's a bunch of other entities out there who are still looking to maybe buy allowances to increase their cap, and so they can purchase offsets from you, right? And so what is this whole mechanism doing? It is essentially a reward, right, to any entities who are partaking in production of goods or services that reduce emissions, because I can use those offset credits to basically make money by selling them to other companies. Yeah.
So does that project, in a way, sort of like permanently get an offset credit every year?
Ah, yes. Now we're getting into like the that's kind of an interesting part about offsets, right? Because how do you oftentimes, so like a forestry program, right? You may have these like counterfactuals where, well, actually, this is even easier. The program I was just talking about, where we switch everyone to being vegetarian, like, do I get just the credits for the emissions that they offset that year of all the beef that they didn't eat, or should I get it, or is that like a one-time thing, or should you count it towards all these things in the future? I think in this particular example, maybe it's a little bit easier because it's like, oh, if they're like switching back to eating meat later, then maybe you shouldn't get those credits, right? But actually, that is a controversial part of the carbon offset program, that oftentimes you're dealing with these like counterfactual scenarios where it's like, oh, what would have happened in a very different future, and like how long do you get to count offsets? Forestry programs, like, let's say you grow a bunch of trees to uptake carbon, right? Once those trees are mature, like technically speaking, the amount of like carbon that they're pulling out of the atmosphere might be a lot lower, but there's a question of whether you should, still be getting those carbon offsets. And so there are aspects of the cap and trade program, particularly as it relates to these offsets, that are maybe a little bit more controversial.
So is it more so at the discretion of whatever CARB district?
Yes. So they have criteria about how they assign the offsets.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
There's also that scheme where it's sort of the other side of the counterfactual, where so for the meat thing, were those people going to quit eating meat anyway? Or
Yep. Exactly.
the forestry, where they can keep the forest anymore if they get cut up?
Yeah. Yeah. So yes, the other part that is maybe sketchy about these carbon offsets are like, instead of like growing trees, they might say, oh, we were planning to cut down these trees, but instead we won't, and so you should give us carbon offsets, right? And now it's like, well, yeah. So that part of the counterfactual is pretty interesting as well. Livestock is a pretty fun one. So you guys have heard of methane from cows? Does anyone know how that works? So they say cow farts, but actually it's not. This is like a very common misconception. I don't know how this came about. So gas from cows, they emit a lot of methane, which is a very harmful greenhouse gas. It's like 30 times worse than carbon dioxide. it's not from farts, it's actually from burps. And so when you feed cows like typical like corn feedstock, then it tends to lead to a lot of methane emissions from cows. And so one of the things that was done was some farmers changed the feedstock. I think they gave them like some percentage of like kelp or seaweed in the feedstocks to help reduce methane emissions, and then they ended up actually being able to demonstrate that and then get carbon offset credits in value. Right. Yeah, so emissions reduction projects are ways to negate impact of CO2. And so you can use money from offset purchases to fund other activities. And so kind of in the similar way that we were talking about with the carbon tax, you have the actual activity effect, which is what the offset is incentivizing, and then you can use the actual revenues from the offsets to support activities as well. Yeah.
If a carbon producing firm directly invested in, say, windmill or solar technology, is that also considered eligible for carbon offset benefit, or?
Yes. Yeah. If you, yeah, how much do we want to get into this? Yeah, so not if it's just, well, I think they changed the rules, but I don't think you can get it if you're just purchasing RECs, but you can get it if you demonstrate like a real counterfactual through like a PPA, something like that. So power purchase agreement. So you can't get it if you are just saying you're buying renewable electricity, because that stuff will get produced anyways. But if you make an investment or you guarantee that you're like a power purchase agreement that leads to the construction of new renewable power, then that would count. Yeah. Okay. So they do set a kind of price floor. This is a little bit older. You can see here that the prices per ton in the cap and trade market in California is actually quite low, right? Especially when we think about in the context of some of the dollar values we were seeing in carbon taxes, and obviously compared to the social costs of carbon. Over time, what would we expect the prices to do? Yeah.
Well, because the cap is going down over time, and
Which,
the abatement gets more expensive.
yeah, so as the cap goes down, at the beginning, maybe you have a bunch of easy stuff that you can do and to mitigate, and so the value of the credit is not as high. And then over time, the cap keeps going down, and suddenly everyone is mitigating, and then your options for doing mitigation become more expensive, and so it costs more essentially to purchase allowances on the cap and trade. And so indeed, if we see slightly more updated data, there we were looking at this kind of like range in 2017 where you're about $10 to $15 a ton. A couple years later, now you're talking about maybe double that. I don't know what the clearing price is today. If anyone has any ideas or wants to look that up, you can shout out. But I would assume it's a little higher, but it is possible that it goes down every now and then. But your general trend will always be going up. Okay, any questions? Cool. So how do you enforce cap and trade? Right, you have a bunch of different entities across the state who are emitting, and so we need some way to enforce, right? So MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification. So one of the things is that the California Air Resources Board actually has authority to charge violations as a criminal violation. And so you can have very steep fines for noncompliance and actually even jail time in theory. And so there's this health and safety code section that gives them essentially authority to do this. And so, as I understand, generally this hasn't really been an issue. But yeah, cap and trade can be enforced pretty harshly. Okay, so now what I would like for us to do is think about, if you guys can digest for a second and think about in a similar way how you might model the impacts of cap and trade, and think about specifically what differences there are with the carbon tax that you might be able to visualize. So think about this in the context of your models and more generically as well. And I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to discuss, and then we'll reconvene and talk again. All right, same thing.
Well, here you kind of have to model like the market and like how to like estimate what the price would be, right?
I think from an operational standpoint, you could, or maybe have to give like from a cost standpoint, like insurance standpoint, when you get to be able to meet all of our rating levels, you do have to strategize how you're going to
Yeah. I think one thing what you could do, for example, like look at optimization again, because now like you have a fixed cap that you, I mean, there are like ways where you like if the price goes really high, I think like they can release more certificates, but in general there's like a hard cap, right? So you can actually list.
We aim for that, yeah.
Yeah, so you can just put a constraint for each year that says you cannot exceed that cap, and then which is basically, and then the trade, like how the trading happens is just harder to model. But I guess you can basically run the model without the cap and run the cap and see what the cost difference is. And then from that you can probably somewhat infer like what the cost for like a certificate would be. Because like maybe like if you have like run the same model, one with the cap and one without it, let's say it's $1 million more expensive and you have 10 like allowances like in theory, then you can calculate like how much allowance would be, right? And then the question is just how do you model that through step? And I guess then the control is the higher like I don't know. So that's the harder part. I think it's a bit harder to model in text, but we'll have to look at it a bit more to come up with like a. I think in general that's like how you could approach this. But yeah, but it becomes harder if you then also include like technically, like if the price gets really high, release more allowances, which I think is allowed in California. I think so. But I think that
everyone's done. So raise your hand if you think it's easier to model than the carbon tax. And raise your hand if you think it's harder to model than the carbon tax. Okay. Maybe we'll go around the room in the other direction this time. How about in the back? What do you guys think? Anyone? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I just think carbon tax is easier to monitor because it's more like a flat fee, so you can basically the companies are offsetting their emissions with the tax, so I think like it's easier to and also like each company that emits is kind of isolated, like they're paying like according to their emissions, so like their considerations can be isolated to that company, but then carbon trade they need to consider the market as well, and also that the cap is kind of decreasing every year. So this means like it's more of you to like model it as an integrated market system rather than just each company individually.
Yeah, so importantly, yes. So if we think about this idea in the carbon tax where we had some X activity and you can represent the cost by the emissions of that activity times the tax of that activity. So this would be cost associated with the tax. Let's see here. So cap and trade. Here you would need to essentially know what's happening with emissions associated with everyone, right? And so you have maybe some kind of constraint, X activity times C emissions of your activity has to be less than or equal to R cap. So this would show up as a constraint. And as you were saying, instead of knowing just your own activity, you have to know the activity of everyone. And then this is absent even any of the sort of trading mechanisms, right? Yeah.
I mean, to your question again, what's easier to model? I think like the general, like how the system behaves is much harder to model with the cap and trade, but what's easier is to know like how much is being mitigated because that's kind of fixed by the cap. So if you, I mean, technically there could be violations or something, but in general you can with more certainty say that, like how much is being mitigated.
I guess it depends on what you're looking for, right? So here, I think the way you would represent this in your optimization objective function, I think it is a little bit more complicated because how would we do this? We would basically be saying you have some allowances which have some costs associated with them, right? So X activity, C allowance for any particular activity times the cost of those allowance. And then you'd probably have to let me see. Yeah. For this, whoa, okay, hang on. Oops. So for this term, maybe there's, I'm gonna change this to maybe not be C. Maybe this is some kind of X here. This would be the sum of if this is so allowance trading from act to, okay, we'll say something like this, from I to J. Yeah, so it gets more complicated because you're having to kind of keep track of the allowances from others, and you could assume that it would just follow some kind of cost, in which case you can simplify it. In which case it'll just look similar to a carbon tax. So you could reduce it in form to be something similar to a carbon tax, but I don't think it'll be simpler than that.
Yeah, it's probably hard. Like you could probably also represent it as like kind of like a network problem, and then you have kind of like model these equilibriums, but like then
Possibly. I mean,
it becomes very computationally heavy if you want to model each like actor.
yeah, and if you're focusing on one particular sector, that wouldn't, or company, that wouldn't be the way to do it. Yeah, you could probably simplify it by looking at like prices on the market. Okay, other folks, what do you guys think? Differences with cap and trade and carbon taxes? Did you guys talk about this at all? Sure.
Well, in general, I would say the difference is that with the carbon tax, the price is certain, but the amount of emissions is more uncertain. While with the cap and trade, the price is uncertain, but how much you emit is more certain.
Yeah, exactly. So that's gonna be one of the primary trade-offs, and something that is very visible in the modeling space is your ability to kind of set the emissions or the prices. Okay. Any questions, comments? Okay, so another area of scope expansion, if you guys are interested in thinking about that as it relates to your project, and happy to help with that if it is of interest. So let's talk a little bit about some of the modeling that's been done with respect to this particular policy, and thinking about various impacts and nuances of the policy. So, forecasting effect of cap and trade on emissions. So this is some work by some prominent economists in this field. So looking at, okay, basically the emissions effect, right? And so as you ramp down your annual cap levels, what it's actually going to look like in terms of outcomes in emissions. And part of this work was specifically focused on thinking about kind of the prices that we would see on those markets, right? And so one of the ideas is that like with cap and trade, as Simon was mentioning, there's a lot more uncertainty into prices. And we think about that as a pretty important aspect of driving like business decision making, right? If there's a lot of uncertainty into how much things are gonna cost into the future, that in itself is like a pretty big cost to your system. And so this work did a bunch of sort of economic sort of partial equilibrium modeling to understand what we expect the allowance prices, or how we expect them to change as we increase greenhouse gas reductions as a effect of the cap getting put into place. And so allowance prices can vary depending on sort of the amount of abatement that's happening versus kind of the sort of cost of cost of the credits, right? And so here we're looking at allowance prices in 2030, kind of as high as $85 a ton. So back when this was in place, I think that was, or back when this piece was first looked at, those prices would be considered quite high relative to what we thought of the social cost of carbon at the time, $50. But now, knowing that it's actually substantially higher, this stuff kind of looks actually like a good deal. Okay, other criticisms of cap and trade. So I think this is a pretty important concept to understand. So suppose you provide allowances to oil companies that sell gasoline with some expectation that growth is going to be happening, right? And so this is thinking about the sort of original allocation of some of those credits. So if we were to go back in time, hypothetically, and draw these sort of outward trends lines, maybe you think the projection might look something like this, right? And then you set the allowances to be lower because you're saying, okay, we actually need to decrease our emissions by 2 to 3% a year. And so instead of giving you allowances that allow you, the full sort of black line, I'm going to give you allowances up to that sort of dotted line. But what actually ends up happening is what you see in the blue. Okay, and so maybe there's a sudden change in activity relative to my counterfactual expectation. And so what ends up happening is you give them a lot more allowances than they need, right? That's the delta between my blue line and my dotted line. And so in reality, I've now kind of provided a windfall for that oil company. And they have all of these extra allowances to sell. And so this can be an issue with these types of programs where the allowances are based on expectations of specific types of trends that can happen. Okay, another type of issue is known as leakage. So this was particularly prominent in like cement and concrete, I believe. So the idea here is something like a cement producer. They are faced with the prospect of producing allowances in order to operate in California, right? And so producing cement may lead to a lot of emissions. Okay, and so instead of paying for allowances, they're going to be like, okay, I think it's better for our business to just move to Nevada. And instead, I'm just going to produce the cement there and then, bring to make sure that the emissions that my business is doing won't be counted against me because we're only getting enforced for emissions activities that are happening in the state. So the net emissions, right, which we actually, so when we think about the emissions implications, we're talking about greenhouse gases, right, with carbon. So that doesn't matter where you emit it. it's a green. It will affect globally, and so it reduces emission like local GHG emissions in California, but on the net may not be actually decreased because you end up just shifting those emissions from California out to Nevada. And in some cases, it could actually make it worse. Like if you're doing electricity production, we'll look at an example of that in a second. Yeah, maybe it's harder or less clean to do it in Nevada after leakage, and so you actually might make emissions go up as a result of this cap and trade effect. Okay. Any questions about that? Yeah.
How come, or is it like ever the case where it would apply to where the thing is being sold rather than produced? Because like in California, like there's regulations on vehicles that are not made in California, but they're sold here and they still have to comply with like California regulations.
Yeah. But the difference is that the vehicles are operating in California. So ARB has regulations for vehicles sold in California because once they start operating, they have to follow those rules. But actually, the like production and upstream, like building of the cars themselves don't have to follow the emission rules in California. Yeah. Yes.
Based on this, would the carbon tax be the better solution then?
So both cap and trade and carbon tax, you would want both systems to be applied everywhere, right?
For carbon tax, is it levied on the product or the company activity?
So it would be on the activity generally, yeah.
And this wouldn't matter if they push it outside California or not.
Yes. Generally, you would want to levy it on the activity, and a lot of times it shows up in the like product part because they pass the cost down to the customer, but it wouldn't. Yeah, in this particular example, it wouldn't get assessed in the first place because the activity is not happening, and that's all having to do with jurisdiction, right? Yeah.
Kind of on the inverse, I mean, is there incentive for low emission or zero emission producers, companies, et cetera, to come to California to?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the like proportion of like renewables in like Nevada compared to California, right? As a solar producer, I would much prefer to be in a state that's where I might be able to get credits, where incentives are more plentiful, right? Because of all of these things that are happening. And so, yes, you do have a big incentive if you are able to like produce carbon offsets, for example, to be able to get credits for that in California. Okay, so there's a particularly kind of egregious example of this cap and trade leakage issue in the electricity sector, known as resource reshuffling. So the idea is basically that a utility that imports coal from other regions can divest from long-term contracts in order to meet allowances. So let's say I'm PG&E and I used to have a let's say some kind of power purchase agreement with a coal plant out in Nevada or Arizona, and because of cap and trade, I'm going to divest from this contract, which basically means, okay, I said I promised I would purchase power from you. I'm going to break this contract, and thereby the utility is able to meet their sort of allowance obligations. But in the meantime, that coal plant can simply produce electricity for other entities, right? And so they may enter into a PPA with a different utility outside of California and still produce that electricity. And so this is essentially the same example of leakage happening, but under the sort of mechanics of how the electricity system works. And so the resource reshuffling is a sort of particular term talking about this kind of the shifting of who is producing power. And so there's been some examination of this with what happens in terms of emissions under what actually happened versus with no cap and trade, and they're able to kind of show the sort of general effects that that under the actual case, we actually see that there is a little bit of increased emissions in certain regions under the capped one compared to the no cap. And so there's this kind of resource. When you look at the sort of counterfactual example, we suspect that there actually is some resource reshifting that's leading to increased coal production, not only a non-decrease, but actually an increase in coal production in some of the areas outside of California. Okay. Large number, so another criticism of cap and trade, oversupply. So there's a large number of banked allowances. And so a lot of entities were taking the sort of easy to meet targets and banking up allowances that then they could use to meet later targets. And so the sort of emissions trajectory is going to look a little bit different. So here is a plot of what this looks like. So on an annual basis, you have annual allowances that are used to cover the emissions, but then if they're exceeded, right, so this is the actual emissions, then you can bank those and use them later. So this is, in some regards, a little bit similar to our earlier example, where the allocations were done incorrectly, in which case you are essentially reducing later targets because of that sort of missed allocation. Oh, any questions about this? Okay. Last one I wanted to talk about, secondary benefits of cap and trade. I think this is a nice little example where folks had done some explicit air pollution monitoring and modeling to look at kind of the synergistic effects of having cap and trade. So the idea basically is that when we think about carbon emissions, right, where are carbon emissions coming from generically?
Combustion.
Yeah, combustion, right, of different fossil fuels. And so anytime you're combusting any type of fossil fuel, you are emitting carbon dioxide, but likely you are emitting other secondary pollutants as well. And so one of the things that they looked at was it also so happens that many facilities, especially industrial facilities that emit carbon, tend to be co-located in certain areas, right? And so if you look at co-location with people of color, so this is number of greenhouse gas facilities within 2.5 miles. So looking at sort of across the state, as you have more and more facilities within this 2.5 mile of particular areas, you can see that the locations that have the most greenhouse gas emission facilities tend to be heavily correlated in block groups that have higher proportions of people of color, and then here, similarly, in terms of poverty, as you have more and more facilities, they tend to be correlated more with, places that are above 2x the poverty line. So we would normally think that, the cap and trade thing is going to provide a lot of good secondary benefits. But actually a lot of the carbon offsets actually limit some of the benefits from what has been identified as the largest producers, right? And so here, change in emitter covered by greenhouse gas emissions by industrial sector. So they looked at a lot of these facilities and see, how these things have changed over time. So this is, I think, a nice example where the application of some of the system modeling techniques that we talk about in the class are applied to a kind of particular specific issue that's tied directly to this kind of larger policy of interest. Yeah.
I find this interesting because in another class we've read a paper where they also talked about this air pollution connection with cap and trade and the environmental justice gap. And there they said actually the cap and trade reduced air pollution, especially in areas.
So generally it does, right? Because any effect that you're having, but I think this particular paper was looking at specific large polluters.
Okay, so specific facilities.
Where they could get away with not decreasing as much. And this is a little bit older paper, so it could be the case that some of the offsets that they originally were using might not be enough anymore. So
there's a cap now though on the amount of offsets that you can use. Right?
okay,
It's
did that
8%.
change in the 2020
I feel like it might
update?
have changed.
Yeah, because this is back in 2015, 2016, I think. So.
Yeah, because you can't use offsets in the same way that you use permits now.
Ah, okay.
So you can only use a certain small percentage of offsets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In which case, maybe this is less true. But I'll look into that. Thanks. Okay, and kind of the last thing, just as context, right? So we have mainly been focused in thinking in the California context, but this is some perspective of kind of what this looks like worldwide in terms of these sort of broader carbon policies. And so if we look at California specifically, that is an emissions trading scheme, otherwise known as cap and trade, has been implemented. And then I mentioned that a couple of provinces in Canada joined up with California, and so you can actually see it's actually shaded in red and green, which means that they have both an emissions trading scheme and a carbon tax. Okay. Countries in red are those that have a carbon tax as opposed to emissions trading scheme, and then those in yellow are considering it. Yeah, and then the stripes are like multiple things. So you can get some perspective here about kind of what this looks like in terms of coverage for carbon taxes and cap and trade programs. And remember, emissions are global, and so as good as an individual program is, we do see problems with like leakage. You can't really get around that unless the rest of the world were to implement types of schemes like these. Okay, so still a long way to go. Yeah, like not even the U.S. We don't have anything at the federal level, obviously, and countries like China and regions like the EU do have, yeah, I would say fairly aggressive policies, which is good, but obviously a lot more is kind of needed generally. Yeah.
How does cap and trade work between economies?
So they can be connected, in which case you might have a cap that goes over multiple economies and where you can trade allowances between regions, right? And so that's the case in like California and Canada. If they are disconnected caps, right, then the market for credits is going to be different. And so you may still have things like leakage happening where maybe I go to a weaker market, but still it's better in some regards because the full effect of that leakage mitigation is not going to be the same as if you didn't have like a market, right? So imagine if Nevada had a cap and trade market that was weaker than California, so the prices were lower. The cement producer moving to Nevada may have an easier time in like purchasing allowances and doing emissions, but there's still kind of a cap that's gonna be forcing them to take some kind of action.
Okay, that explains the cap part, but then the trade part comes into question because you have different economies, different.
Yeah, so there's inefficiencies because you're only trading allowances within your particular market. So the most economically efficient would be a cap and trade that would go over everyone, and then you could efficiently decide on your abatement measures as opposed to abatement measures that are unique to particular regions. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so that's it for today. Yeah, we'll make sure to get your homeworks in. Otherwise, I will see you guys on Wednesday.